I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
So now, the hate that hate produced. While city officials, state agencies, white liberals, and sober-minded Negroes stand idly by, a group of Negro dissenters is taking to street corner step ladders, church pulpits, sports arenas, and ballroom platforms across the United States to preach a gospel of hate that would set off a federal investigation if it were preached by Southern whites. What are they saying? Listen, 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 listen.
And people always ask, what is hate about? Why would you hate on anything? Why don't you fill yourself with love? We don't love the conditions that stand below love, so we gotta hate on that.
And I want to say this here today too. If people are offended by so-called words of profanity, that word motherfucker, I didn't invent it. It was invented by a motherfucker who understands what a motherfucker is. Somebody that fuck over your air, fuck over your water, fuck over your children. So I'm saying, don't get offended by the words, get offended by the motherfucker that is standing behind the word and do something about that. People talking about Pam Africa, talk profanity. But what is more profane than the act of these motherfuckers? I'm not confused about motherfuckers, okay? And I'm saying we gotta learn to call it when we see it. And don't be ashamed to call it. And those that oppose them, we must not be afraid to do the righteous battle. Because our children, our mothers, our loved ones are on the line.
Motherfuckers don't want me. Black skin never win in this motherfucking country. Motherfuckers act like it's cool. Racism, the motherfucker boo-hoo. Black billionaires and millionaires, high gloss with kingly ears. Occupants of the lid, that is America. Drunk off what's usually there. Don't care enough to share in the mouth that truly dare. People laugh at you. Talk about Africa. You love it so much, nigga, go back there. Well, motherfucker, that's mighty whitey. Yeah, wish I could, cause I'm tired of fighting. Yeah, motherfucking ignorant asses. Lies taught in classes, make it hard to enlighten ya. But luckily, motherfucker, I'm patient. Awoke with hope and the scope to say shit. Social agent amongst my peers, the favorite. They let me put a dope, be flagrant. Motherfucker, way I stated. Well, let me spit fire on these thieves. The Bush administration just to seize. Tell the motherfuckers and niggas believe. Like Colin Powell, Condoleezza, J.C. Watts, we don't need ya. Can't y'all see y'all working for Caesar? These motherfucking geezers, the same ones that smacked your pappy. Got all crappy when you patted your nappy and called you when he saw you. Claim the famous fuck on you. Niggas.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. All right, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like Live. I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. Again, imixwhatilike.org, at I Mix What I Like for all your relevant social media. We have a great program set up we're going to get to in just a minute. I thought it was perfectly appropriate to dust off one of our old tracks from the Hate Harder series, featuring, of course, Pam Africa, who was featured in the 40 Years a Prisoner documentary. The subject we're going to start our conversation off with tonight. There with my man Head Rock, the mayor of DC hip hop, on a classic track that I put together some years ago and thought was, again, appropriate to dust off here. Before we do get to our guest tonight, and I'm going to bring them up in just a quick second, I do want to quickly remind some folks of a couple of things, including, as we've been trying to do, is continue to highlight some issues with political prisoners. So what I've already put in the YouTube links for, and we'll put it at imixwhatilike.org, of course, as well, are links to a couple of things to highlight and encourage people to follow up on. Not the least of which, again, because political prisoners were the subject of tonight's discussion, and of many that we're going to be having here and have been having here. I thought it was appropriate to do that, and I just want to quickly encourage people to once again go to the National Jericho Movement website, but also to this recent article in the SF Bay View about Rachelle Mcgee, who is not often talked about, but who has sent out a letter that they've reprinted here. We've put the link in the video for YouTube, and we'll have it at imixwhatilike.org as well. But as it says here, he's the longest unjustly held political prisoner in the United States, under lockdown for nearly 6 decades. Rachelle Mcgee was a key figure in the 1970 Marin County Civic Center shootout, but was acquitted of murder along with Angela Davis. We must demand his immediate release now. And for a lot of the discussion and focus that Angela Davis rightly deserves, her at the time co-defendant, all there on, involved with Jonathan Jackson, the younger brother of George Jackson, in the attempt to free and to be freed. There was the shootout ensued, Jonathan killed, the judge killed, and Mcgee acquitted of those charges, but he's been held down for all these decades. So we encourage people to check out this story and get on to supporting him as well. And same thing with just checking out the National Jericho Movement website and staying abreast of all the issues with political prisoners, including the ones we're going to be talking about tonight associated with the MOVE movement and Mumia Abu-Jamal. So let me just get to our guests, one of whom you already know. Dr. Todd Stephen Burrows has been with us many times and will continue to be with us. And please check out our recent video discussion of his review of Obama's recent memoir. Nationally known journalist, journalism professor, independent freelance researcher, drums at theglobalvillage.com is where you can find him. And then also someone he put me in touch with years ago, and I've just been honored to be able to be involved with, engaged with. And I want to point out before even bringing him up that he is someone who is emblematic of something that doesn't happen often enough in academia or in the professional world at all. He actually looks out for people and shows public support, private support, working to help them sustain themselves, build their careers, and in some ways stay out of trouble. So it's something that we don't see often enough, and I just wanted to highlight. He's been a personal great help to me beyond just the guidance in terms of his career as a journalist, an activist and spokesperson on behalf of Mumia Abu-Jamal. And that is Professor Lynn Washington Jr., who is a veteran journalist who spent years in Philadelphia covering the MOVE movement. He currently teaches courses in investigative reporting, journalism, law, and multimedia reporting and news writing. He co-created the department's innovative Multimedia Urban Reporting Lab. For 8 years, he also directed and co-directed PhiladelphiaNeighborhoods.com, the department's capstone class. Student work in that urban reporting focused class earned nearly 36 regional and national journalism awards during his time with that program, as well as best practices recognition from the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication. Washington also continues to work as a professional journalist for news entities, print, online, across the U.S. and in Europe, for which he has been recognized with awards. He frequently serves as an expert commentator, including appearances on a lot of national and international mainstream media, and he has directed study abroad programs for Temple University School of Media and Communication in London and South Africa. And of course, he was featured in the recent documentary about which we're going to discuss tonight, 40 Years a Prisoner. I want to welcome both of my colleagues and comrades and mentors. I appreciate you both. Welcome to this live stream, to the program. Good evening.
Good evening. I just wanted to say something I've never said publicly. That's become my new thing now, Brother Jared, right? I now admit things that I normally don't admit publicly. Normally a person is honored by receiving a letter of recommendation for tenure. I was honored to write a letter of recommendation for tenure for Linn Washington. And I really didn't know at the time who I was writing that letter for, because Linn was this very humble guy who I met, talking about Mumia. I would call him up and interview him for The Source and for other places. And, he was always very generous. And, like he would do the interview and then I would just take what he said and make $300 and be very happy. But I didn't really learn until, as I started to look at his career, how serious this brother has been. And he is somebody who, you talked about how he is important in terms of the personal relationships. I would like to talk about how important he is in terms of his public stances, because to be for Mumia Abu-Jamal and work for a white institution in Pennsylvania is dangerous. And the fact that he has never swerved, never wavered from his support of Mumia Abu-Jamal, no matter what the right wing says about him, no matter what other people say about him, I just have the greatest respect for that. And I have never told Linn Washington that. So I just wanted to take that minute and do that now.
Thank you, Todd.
Right on, man. And this is why I like the co-hosting and collaboration, because I can't keep up with everything. So that's why, immediately we had to get Todd involved. There's a lot I want to get to. There's a lot to get to. We have this fortunate opportunity to have you both here. Let me just start off with the broad and vague question. Professor Washington, what did you think of the documentary? What is your initial reaction to the documentary, 40 Years a Prisoner?
Well, I found it to be very impressive. I thought it was a good story, well put together. And the thing that, one of the many things that jumped out at me was the archival material that the director was able to pull together. It really tells not only an extraordinary story of that slice of Philadelphia from 76 through 78, 79, but it tells a story that has not been told adequately before. So I was really impressed with it.
Right on. By the way, I just want to let everybody know, if you look at the bottom and you see the scroll, all money raised during this live stream or all money raised in relationship to this live stream will go to either the Jericho movement or something related to the movement more directly. And I'll even ask Linn Washington for advice on that as well. But I don't want anybody, I do want to encourage people to support if you can. I understand these are difficult times for everybody, but if you can and you have the interest, just rest assured that's where the money's going, or feel free just to donate to them directly without going through us or me. Dr. Burroughs, what did you think of the documentary? What was your initial reaction to the documentary?
Unfortunately, I have not seen the documentary, but I would like to talk about MOVE in terms of my own research on it around that period of time. And I would like to talk about Mumia's relationship with MOVE and how that came about. Because I think it's a very important story. And I mean, Lynn was literally there and kind of watched this thing develop. So,
and if I can interrupt real quick, this is important because there's actually two tracks sort of to tonight's conversation, one specifically about Mumia and his case. And there's a lot that I've even just learned recently about, Lynn, your involvement in covering that I'm way late to, that we have got to talk about. But then there's also his relationship to the MOVE organization, none of which was really covered in the documentary. I'm not even sure, other than being pictured in Pam Africa's interview, that Mumia was even mentioned. I'm not even sure he was discussed. So this will be an important bridge for you to quickly build for us.
Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the foundation. I'm going to put them both in the dirt, and I'm going to let those two things sprout independently. I think I grew up watching Gil Noble, so I'm used to using little metaphors like that in broadcasting. Right? MOVE is defined in the scholarly literature, and I am going to call you Dr. Ball this one time, Dr. Ball. MOVE is defined in the scholarly literature as being a techno-anarchist organization. And I thought that was very interesting because I didn't know there was some kind of term for this. What MOVE did was basically pioneer some practices that are now considered mainstream, composting and, not ingesting chemicals in your body, using natural, herbs and things in terms of soaps. I mean, all of these things that many people who are environmentally conscious do now, MOVE was doing back in the 70s. And MOVE had a very clear philosophy. It was led by a interracial pairing, by the way, the guy who became John Africa, and a white guy who later kind of dropped out of the group. They founded this group. And I'm trying to remember, is John Africa's name Vincent Leapart when? Is that correct?
Yes, that was his birth name, Vincent Leapart, and he adopted the name of John Africa.
Thank you. Yeah, Vincent Leapart was known as a guy who walked a lot of people's dogs.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was known as the Dog Man.
Vince the Dog Man.
Yeah, right, Dog Man, is that right?
Vince the Dog Man, that's what he was known as in Powhatan.
Thank you. And so he and I said this white guy, I forget his name, they co-founded the MOVE organization, which was originally called the Christian Movement for Life, right? Mm-hmm. But later they shortened it for MOVE. And so they started doing practices that perhaps were not conducive to being in an urban area. So if you do composting, let's say in an urban area, and you have things in the grass or whatever, that might draw rats, right? That might draw insects. And see, because MOVE believed in all life being sacred, even the life of rats and of ants and other insects, they caused quite a stir just as in terms of just being neighbors, right? In a neighborhood. They also caused quite a stir because they had very clear philosophies about nature and that nature superseded man's law. So they believed air should be fresh to breathe. They believed water should be free. They believed in being completely natural. And so, like for instance, they washed with herbs. It was said that they didn't wash, which is untrue. They washed with herbs. Now, people said they smelled. Well, they smelled like herbs, right? Because that's what they washed with, because they weren't interested in those chemicals. So they had a very, very serious philosophy. And I want to say this, when I started doing research on MOVE, people act like MOVE is some sort of crazy aberration that just happened in the 70s, just happened in Philadelphia. There had been groups like MOVE around for decades across the country and across the world. And there were several groups in the 70s that attempted to, experimental living, experimental modes of being, etc. So MOVE got this reputation of being very militant in terms of their denunciation of the system and their denunciation of the very racist police department run by Frank Rizzo. Frank Rizzo, for those of you who don't know, imagine Donald Trump as a chief of police. That's you have Frank Rizzo, right? It's simple as that. I mean, even down to the loud mouth and all of that, it's all there. So MOVE occupied this space in Philadelphia. Now, Philadelphia is a black bougie city, right? It's a city that had as an NAACP president Cecil Moore, who literally said, "I am a black nationalist in support of Malcolm X." So imagine having the head of the NAACP be Cecil Moore. Now, Brother Jared, I want you to imagine this because you're a radio brother. Imagine having your top DJ, the one who can organize the black community, as your vice president. And that was Georgie Woods, the man with the goods. So you had a black nationalist president of the NAACP, and you had a brother who could organize the community on the radio in the 60s. So, of course, the national NAACP responded by destroying the Philadelphia chapter and breaking it up so that they wouldn't have that kind of power again. See, Philadelphia is a middle-class city, right? So they respected people like Father Washington of the Church of the Advocate, because what he would do is he would quietly be in support of the militants and the revolutionaries, etc. But they did not like that open, blatant support. And MOVE represented that in spades. Now, to get to the former West Cook, right? So here you have Mumia Abu-Jamal, Mumia named by an African high school teacher, right, who gave all of his class students in Ben Franklin High African names. So he's named by this African Mumia. He chooses the name Jamal for his first son after he leaves the Black Panther Party. So he literally has named himself the father of his son. That's how close he is to family and to community. So Mumia Abu-Jamal means Mumia, father of Jamal, right? So Mumia is developing this radio career, but he's very decolonized. He rides around on a bike. He doesn't use a car. He interviews the head of the local marijuana users association and later becomes its president. So by the time he's arrested, he's identified in the Philadelphia Inquirer and other places as president of the Philadelphia Marijuana Users Association. But he drives around, but he rides around the bike. He wears coveralls. He rejects what was then a six-figure job or equivalent of six-figure job in local television. He does a tryout on local television. He interviews Dr. J. There's a famous picture of him interviewing Dr. J with his dreadlocks covered. He gives up this television job because they told him to cut off his dreads, and he refused to do so. Now, to show you, again, Brother Jared, you know that the African experience is nonlinear. It's the same refusal of cutting off his dreads, which allows him to be in solitary for the first 8 or 9 years of his incarceration, his post-conviction incarceration. So here you have Mumia, who's a decolonized cat, right? He's in the 70s. He's in the groove. And he's depressed because of the East Coast, West Coast battle that destroyed the Black Panther Party. And he refuses to ever join another organization again. He did join the Association of Black Journalists in Philadelphia, which is now called the NABJ chapter in Philadelphia. Well, they were founded before NABJ, right? So he becomes president of that group. And by the way, he expands that group to include Latinos. So a young journalist in Philadelphia named Juan Gonzalez joins the ABJ. And, you know, that's how he and Mumia become friends, right? So he's practicing his craft. He's on NPR, the station where Terry Gross Fresh Air comes out of. He's on WDAS in the weekends. And, you know, he starts to cover events in the community. So he goes out and he meets these MOVE members. And these MOVE members touch something very deep in him, touch something very decolonized in him. And so he notices that because of MOVE's stylings, that they don't get really good coverage, not even in the Black press. So, for instance, there is this tradition, and Brother Jared knows this, about marginalized groups going to Black newspapers and getting columns, right? Most famous of this probably is the Amsterdam News, in which Malcolm X would shop around Elijah Muhammad's column across the country, and that's how he did that. Now he shopped around Elijah Muhammad's column because he got in trouble because when he wrote his own column for the Amsterdam News, it was really a long article that they cut up in pieces called God's Angry Men. It got too much attention, right? But this tradition. So MOVE gets a column in the Philadelphia Tribune, which is the city's most prominent Black papers. And by the way, there's this young rabble-rouser who is loud and profane, and her name is Jeanette. I forgot who Jeanette's last name was. And Jeanette was very serious and dedicated to MOVE to the point where, you know, she even left her own family for MOVE, and people wrote articles about her. And that's the person who we now know as Pam Africa. So Mumia gets in this environment. I'm almost done because I definitely want my brother Washington to speak because he lived all of this. I'm just reading. So Mumia becomes attached to this group and then begins to try to cover this group. And he runs into some resistance. I'll tell you one quick story, Brother Ball, because this is important to tell, because this is somebody you remember in radio. He talked, and Live from Death Row, he talks about he went and covered the MOVE protest in front of the Operation Push headquarters, right? Young Jesse Jackson was having his meeting, and MOVE people were interrupting it. So he comes back with this wild sound, the sound of fighting with MOVE, and his news director says, "You can't do this. You can't air this." And he's on Black radio. And he's like, "What do you mean I can't do this?" And he fights with the news director saying, "No, I'm going to air this because this is news." Now, who was that director? It was Bernie McCain. You might find that interesting, right? Because Bernie was all around the radio, all up and down the East Coast. And of course, I know about Bernie McCain being in Washington, D.C. and from WL. So now Mumia becomes, like I said, he becomes first, as a journalist, he becomes interested in MOVE and thinks they should be covered fairly. And then he becomes an adherent to MOVE. And I'm going to hurt some feelings here. I know a lot of people want to talk about Mumia got kicked off the radio because of police brutality. Not true. He got kicked off the radio for two reasons. One, he was so move-oriented that he turned his newscast into movecasts. That was one thing. The other thing was he got kicked off the weekend shift at WDAS, the top soul radio station, because he, quote-unquote, did not fit their image. And he wrote this long memo to Cody Anderson, which has been scrubbed from the web, but see, I got it before they scrubbed it, in which he articulated completely his decolonized philosophy, saying, I can't believe, Cody, that you've been such a traitor and Uncle Tom on this, because you know that I've won awards, I've done all of this kind of stuff. And because Mumia was independent, he was intellectually independent. So he was attracted to Move because Move was intellectually independent. Now, to show you how this can go, again, non-linear, it was Cody Jackson, it was the younger Cody Jackson's son, that Mumia then turns to when he has that amazing press conference when he defends himself against Buzz Bissinger. When Buzz Bissinger was in Variety talking about he confessed, which was not true. So as you see, you see all of these kind of interconnected things, right? Father Washington, whose church is where they have the memorial for Fred Hampton. Right? We just talked about Fred Hampton last week. Well, it was at Father Washington's church where Mumia spoke about Fred Hampton. There's a famous picture of him speaking. So you have that. You have Move. You have Black Radio. You have the ABJ. And you have all these other organizations that Mumia covered on his bike. But it's Move that's at his center, because it's Move that allowed him to look at what he always cared about, which was different elements of freedom. And it's freedom is what we're going to be talking about tonight, I'm sure, in terms of Move and Mumia. I'm sorry to go so long, folks. I just wanted to get some basic things in, and then I know Brother Washington will come in with his first person. So I apologize to you.
And we haven't even gotten to the point where, obviously, where Mumia, is engaged in whatever occurs that ends up having him accused of killing Daniel Faulkner. And Lynn, let me just bring you in here because. And I'm tempted to ask you to do it this way, but obviously, please respond however you'd like, or add whatever you'd like. I found and I've since lost it already, but I found your, I guess, submitted is this testimony about being one of the first on hand to the scene where Faulkner is killed. And you were outlining all of the things wrong with the procedure, the crime scene. So I thought of if you could, and I had never seen this before. Mm-hmm. And the way you were describing, walking up to the car, seeing blood, and you're only there a few hours after this event has occurred and nobody is there. And it seemed like you were, if I have it correctly, almost outlining a context for what Philadelphia was like as it relates to the police and then the Black community. It almost seemed like you were explaining that as you were explaining all that was wrong in this crime scene. And I honestly, I feel terrible having never read that before. I think 2 days ago, but anyway, I thought so. As Todd was laying that out, if we could start there, we could talk about what that was like, and even have that be part of what explains the context of Move in Philadelphia and Mumia, all of which is unfortunately, or a lot of which is not in this documentary.
Right. Well, the documentary that's out now, 40 Years a Prisoner, really looks at a very specific time period, well, for the better part, and that's the Move organization from 76 to around, the 78 shootout, August 8th of 1978, and then into their trial. And then it kind of leapfrogs 40 years forward as those persons were kept incarcerated far too long. The document that you were referencing was an affidavit that I put together. And it's kind of ironic that I'm here with Todd, because I had gone to Pittsburgh, because that's where I grew up. And Mumia's attorneys at the time were there, and they were south of the city on don't want to get into too much, etc. But they were there working on the case. So I went down ostensibly to look at the trial records. I had heard about them, had never seen them. I go to this apartment. It's like a 3 or 4 bedroom apartment, and every room was just filled with boxes that were related to this case. So I'm looking through it, and they say, well, could you give me an affidavit? And I said, no, I don't get involved in this. This is not what I do. They said, no, we will never use it. We just want to have it for future reference if we need it. And before we use it, we'll talk to you. So let's be real, the quid pro quo. Okay, I'll give you this. You give me access to that stuff. And after I gave them the affidavit, which delineated what I saw that day, and I'll get to that in a minute because it was highly unusual, that crime scene when I arrived on it, a little less than 4 hours after the incident itself happened, between 4 and 5 hours. But I'm coming back to my mom's house, and I get a call from Todd, and he starts talking about this affidavit, and I'm like, what are you talking about? Are you clairvoyant or something? And he said, no, they've introduced it in court. And I'm like, them lousy rascals, man, just lying to me straight up to my face. And now here I'm in the middle of the case. Again, let's be real. Journalists very often have to maintain this facade of objectivity, and particularly Black journalists. Because there's this notion that if you're Black, then you're going to twist things around for Black people, and that wasn't the case with me, and that's not the case with the majority of the Black journalists. But that's the paint that's put on us. So that particular affidavit ostensibly dealt with what I observed when I went to the crime scene on December 9th, 1981. At that time, I was working for the Philadelphia Daily News. I was assigned to City Hall. I was covering City Council. And what would happen with reporters, or at least with me, every morning when I would wake up, I would turn on the news radio station, and whatever story was big, I knew that the Daily News was going to be chasing after it. So I turned on the radio that morning, and I hear a police officer has been killed. And I'm like, oh God, this is like horrible. And the police, and I know what's going to happen today. And then the next word was, and a prominent journalist in the city has been arrested for that. What? Mumia Abu Jamal. Mumia. And when the police arrived at the scene, they found Abu Jamal's brother spread eagle against the wall. And I'm like, wait a minute. The cops arrived and somebody's against the wall before they say up against the wall, fill in the blank. You know how they talk. So this thing from the very beginning just didn't settle out right to me. So I said, okay, let me put on my clothes, take a quick shower, run out the house. My wife was saying, you didn't eat breakfast. As I get around to it, I got to get downtown. So I go to the crime scene. Now, before I got to the Daily News, I started my career at the Philadelphia Tribune, which is the oldest African-American newspaper in the country. And as a young reporter, I got 2 assignments. One was to cover crime, and I finally learned what the blues was. And I'm not talking about, lead belly, Mississippi blues. I'm talking about funk from being in a depressing scene, because the Tribune was into a blood and guts era. They wanted you to go cover crime, and while you were there, you had to take a picture of a body part or some blood. Then you would give it to the city editor. He would blow it up, put it on the front page, put a circle around it, put an arrow in it. And the city editor, that was his day job. His avocation was a minister. This dude was a minister, and he reveled in blood and guts. So I bring that up only to say that I've covered too many crimes. And as a part of that, I understood the procedure would happen with police. So in many crimes, actually in most crimes, the police officers are on scene for hours, maintaining the integrity of the crime scene. And depending on the severity of the crime or the stature of the crime, they may be there for days. So I get there, and I understand, and listen to this. I get there, the crime takes place between 3:30 and 4 o'clock a.m. It was actually, what was it, Todd, 3:54? Or 3:45 or 3:47.
3:45, something like that, right in the morning, right?
I get there around 8:30, There is nobody on scene, not a single cop anywhere. And I'm looking, like, where are they? Are they hiding? I see Billy Cook's Volkswagen. At the time, there had been some reports.
And I just want to stress, this is not just a murder scene, but a scene where a cop is killed.
A cop is killed, right, in Philadelphia, which, as Todd alluded to, Rizzo and, a whole racist, oppressive police regime. And we could get into that later in terms of what's happened in the 70s with this, because that was very formative of what became the MOVE disputes. And the clashes with City Hall was around police brutality, but police brutality related to, some of their lifestyles and some of their actions. So I get there, I had heard that Faulkner and Billy Cook had a tussle. Faulkner had hit Billy Cook with his flashlight, and Billy Cook had gotten in the car. There was some blood in there and whatever. So I go there. So one, I'm shocked that there's no cops around. And that really says something to me, that the police, when they arrested Mumia, felt that the case was open and shut. They didn't have no care of trying to really delve into what happened, and at the very least maintain the integrity of the crime scene. However, in maintaining the integrity of the crime scene, there's a whole history of them not doing it. We're talking about this evening the MOVE confrontation on August 8th, 1978. Well, it took place in this MOVE compound in Powelton Village 3 hours, about 3.5 hours after the shootout and the surrender of the MOVE people and an alleged investigation of a darkened basement that was filled with hundreds of thousands of gallons of water and tear gas and smoke. The city of Philadelphia tore the house down. They destroyed the scene. So here again, with Mumia, years later, actually a couple of years later, the crime scene is not preserved. So I was able to get into Billy Cook's car. Of course, I pulled my handkerchief out before I touched that car, because Lynn Washington's fingerprints was not
right, because you'd have been next up on the thing. Lynn Washington arrested for.
Oh no! So I'm doing like my Columbo thing or whatever.
You could read the headline the next day: Black journalists lead assault against the white establishment of Philadelphia.
Not me. I'm going home tonight. to my kids. So I was able to investigate that. Saw that there was blood in the back seat or on the floor in the back seat. So maybe Cook was in the car with bleeding. Took a little stroll around the scene, try to understand what was going on, but really didn't understand what was going on. So I had no context for that. And the next thing I did was go to the hospital, where I understood that Officer Faulkner had been taken, as well as Mumia had been taken. Now the hospital, Jefferson Hospital, is literally 3 blocks, and that's only because of one-way streets from the crime scene. But when they removed Mumia from the crime scene after beating him to a pulp and ramming his head into his telephone pole accidentally 7 times, it takes them over a half an hour to get to the hospital. So it's clear that they, according to what came out later, they were initially told to take Mumia to homicide to be questioned. Now, Mumia has a critical gunshot wound in his gut. He needed to go immediately to the hospital, but they're going to take him to homicide. What I think, and this is just what I think they were driving him around hoping he died. So I go to the hospital and I run into a couple of other reporters, people who work with Mumia, one being E. Stephen Collins, who actually worked with Mumia at WDAS. And he starts saying, hey, man, look, the Mumia's in the emergency room and, they're beating him up back there. And I said, yeah, I tried to get in the emergency room, but the cops were there and, my press pass didn't get me in. So we were able to interview hospital personnel who saw Mumia getting beaten. And then, things just, I was going to say evolved from there, but no, they actually devolved from there. And we can go into that. But that crime scene was not preserved. That was just the first of what now becomes enough information, evidence, and incidents of impropriety that could literally fill an encyclopedia.
And what Lynn is not going into is that Mumia was shackled to that bed, and that he remained shackled in that basement for like, what, 2 weeks, something like that?
Yeah, they shackled him to the bed. He's under arrest. He's charged with murder. And curiously, when we look at the Mumia case and you hear the opposition say, well, the case is airtight and it's a profound evidence of guilt. Well, if you shoot a gun, and Mumia had a revolver, a 38 revolver with a small barrel, they call them snub nose because they're 2 inches or less. A revolver, when it goes off, gunpowder sprays off the side. So one would suspect that if a gun was fired, then you would have gunpowder residue on your hands, and there would be gunpowder residue on your clothes. But the police maintained that the Abu Jamal, who they had shackled to a bed, they didn't think that he would give them permission to do the gun test, the gunfire test on his hands.
But not only that, Lynn, talk about the.
But wait. But why would you? Since when do they wait for permission to do a gun residue test? A gunpowder residue test.
Professor Ball, you hit the ball right coming over the base.
Permission.
The cops don't need permission for that. They don't need permission in terms of their normal practice, and they don't need permission in terms of the law. The law says that they don't need to get a search warrant to take that type of test. And what is even, I guess, compounding this craziness, I had a conversation with Pam Africa just a few weeks ago, and she was telling me about Abu Jamal's clothes in the chain of custody of the clothes. The police took his clothes, and they had him for months before they returned him to his wife. So one would think that given that time that his clothing was in the custody of police, that they would have checked it for gunpowder.
Right.
Now, if they didn't do it, that was gross incompetence and undermined his fair trial rights. If they did do it and they didn't find anything because they didn't come into court and say they found anything, then that was evidence of innocence that shows more of the injustice that this man has endured for 39 years as of today.
But could you talk about the gun test that you did that disputed the official police report about the angles of the bullets and all that? Because
right.
That's important too.
Oh, yes. You think it's important. Thank you very much. I think it's important. Dave Lindors thought it was important. Michael Schiffman and other people who've looked at this thought it was important. But again, like you just said, you're going to get in trouble with somebody. Let me get in trouble right now. We gave that information to Mumia's attorneys, and they didn't think it was important. What? Let me stop. Well, anyway, the gunshot test. According to the
but Todd is gonna pun intended trump you in a minute, I'm sure, with getting in trouble, because as you were saying before we got started, Todd, the reason Mumia ended up with this bad legal team or this bad legal advice is his own fault, according to you.
And
am I getting the timeline right?
And yes, and you know who I got that from? I got that from first Linn Washington, and then I got that from my own research. Lynn, talk about what Mumia turned down that the Black community offered him. I think it's important to talk about.
Okay, well, let me get to the gun test, and then we'll do that.
Yes.
Like we've, all of us have been saying it during this conversation. There is so much here to get into. Now, in terms of the gunshot, according to the prosecution's case that they put on and what has become the record in this case, Abu Jamal is driving a cab that night. He had been robbed as a cab driver, so he has a legally registered 38 pistol, and he had a legal right to own it. I mean, it was officially registered. What he didn't have is a carry permit. So in some ways, he was illegal by having the gun. But he's at 13th and Locust in Center City, Philadelphia, which is now it's in the neighborhood. But back then, it was a nightlife area. So cab drivers would go there late at night to get fares from people coming out of the nightclubs who were too drunk to drive home, or they didn't have a car, or they shouldn't drive home. So he was there picking up a fare, and there was a 24-hour diner there that the denizens of the night, congregated around, including cab drivers getting a grub between their jobs. So Abu Jamal sees his brother in a confrontation with the police officer. And now I'm just telling you the story according to the police. They say Abu Jamal runs out of a parking lot, runs across 13th Street, pulls out the snub nose, shoots Officer Faulkner in the back. Officer Faulkner spins around, and as he's falling down, he shoots Abu Jamal, and then Abu Jamal comes over Officer Faulkner, straddles him, fires 4 shots. 3 of them miss. 1 of them hits him between the eyes. So that had always, I've always found that problematic. Number one, a snub nose pistol, regardless of what caliber, 22, 38, 44, don't try it, but they're notoriously inaccurate. So you have to be a super good marksman to shoot a short barrel pistol like that. And then for someone who is running in a highly charged situation, it is unlikely that he would have had 1 shot and that 1 shot hit the officer. The other piece is that information came out that the shot that hit Abu Jamal did not come from the bottom up, as would be the case if Faulkner was falling, but it came from the top down. So that was always problematic. And, I know a little bit about ballistics because I grew up around guns. My father was a hunter, and, as a kid, one thing I wanted to be a Formula One driver until I found out that they didn't have black people in Formula One. And then I said, I'll design guns. I started designing guns. So I've been a part of ballistics all my life. So ballistically, the thing never worked out. So now get to the test. In 2009, Dave Lindorf and I were sitting around, we're talking about the case. And Dave Lindorf is an investigative reporter in this area. He wrote an extraordinary book on the case. In fact, it's still the most comprehensive examination of that case. And he's been following the case for years, just like me. We said, that gunshot, it just doesn't sound right. And I said, Dave, there's no way that you could shoot a gun into the sidewalk and it makes no marks. Crime scene photos, right, show no bullet marks, none. There's this famous photo of a stream of blood, and the officer's hat is there, and the narrative is that Officer Faulkner was slain, he was executed by Abu Jamal, and here's the scene. But when you look at it, you don't see any bullet marks. We took those photos and we sent them to a scientist at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. This guy's job is to take photographs from deep space satellites that go out to Saturn and Uranus and, all the way out to the other side of the solar system, and magnify them to see what's there. So he magnified these photographs on a supercomputer, and guess what he found? No bullet marks. So we said we're going to replicate this study. So I was able to get a hold of a snub-nose 38. It was a different brand, but it was the same kind of gun. We got the type of ammunition that Abu Jamal had. We got plus P ammunition, what he had in his gun. We got hollow points. We got metal jacketed, and we got the soft lead. We got a 200-pound piece of sidewalk. Where Dave lives in the suburbs, they were building a new school in his community, so they were tearing up the sidewalk around the old school. And we went out, got the sidewalk, struggling. I mean, the construction workers were laughing at these 2 old skinny guys just trying to get this sidewalk into my Subaru station wagon. Then we went up in the mountains, and to do a test. I mean, you gentlemen have the PhD, and you know how to do research and how the proper protocols are. I'm just a little guy, so I said, let me try to figure out how I can get some authenticity to this. So I got a Penn State University professor. actually a guy I grew up with, who not only knows history, but he knows ballistics. I mean, this is like a mountain man kind of guy. He makes his own bullets. When you go to his house, you go up on his third floor, there's gunpowder and bullets and shells. So I said, I want you to observe this case. So Dave builds a platform that approximates how Abu Jamal could shoot. Fortunately, and this is critical in terms of how lies have been manufactured around Abu Jamal. He had a piece of sheet metal where he put a hole in so we could shoot through it, which would approximate where Abu Jamal was. But at the bottom of it, he put sheet metal down there too. So I performed a gunshot test, fire into it. Every bullet that we use, soft lead, jacketed, hollow points, and just for comparison, my professor friend Arthur, we got his 357 Magnum, which is a powerful gun, just to show, and that just almost shattered the sidewalk. But the point is that every shot that we fired into that sidewalk made a mark. So if that happened in this test, why were there not any marks in the crime scene photos? If in fact he shot 3 times and he missed, those bullets hit the sidewalk. Unless, of course, it was one of these things in the how the Warren Commission that looked at the Kennedy assassination, they somehow
reverse of a magic bullet.
Yeah, the magic bullet, it changes direction in the air. We now live in an era where we have missiles that can be programmed to change directions in the air. Mm-hmm. We now have ballistics that can just about do that, and even including some artillery shells can do that in a minor way. But back in 1981, if a bullet is shot down, that's where it's going. It's not going to just come out of the barrel of the gun and say, whoop.
Well, my question would have been, and still would be, what bullet fired at a range where someone is standing over somebody and is strong enough to puncture skin, bone, tissue, and all of that and kill someone would not cause a mark in the cement? In other words, what wouldn't do that? I mean, what BB gun fired at close range wouldn't leave something? I mean, that's absurd.
Absolutely, Jared. But nothing shot into the ground is not going to leave a mark. But having done this test, I was afraid that shooting into that sidewalk, the bullet would ricochet and shatter my leg.
Right.
So when I saw that Dave had built that little barrier at the bottom, it was like, okay, thank you, Dave, you saved me. When we finished the test, the kick plate, that little portion at the bottom, was all dented from fragments from the bullets, as well as the gravel and cement from the sidewalk that had shot up from being shot into. Now, when you look at that scenario, that shooting into the sidewalk not only makes a mark, but it kicks up dust, and particles. On none of the autopsy reports or any of the property inventory that the police did was there any notation that there was gravel, marks, sand, or anything on the clothing of Officer Faulkner. So we, through this video that we actually, it subsequently turned into a video, and it's on YouTube. If you go and put in Mumia Abu Jamal, Gunshot Test, Linn Washington, Dave Lindorf, you'll see it. It's 7 minutes long. So that was just one of the myriad of things that we've been able to look at, examine, test, and find to be substantially in variance with physical reality and natural law. No.
Now, I do want to quickly have you make this point about why Mumia ended up with the less effective legal team, but we've already gone for almost an hour, so that I want to make sure we at least get to a couple of other things before we all have to leave. there's just so many, because we're not even going to get to the question that I always want to ask when this stuff comes up, which is why would the police want to do this? If it's so obvious he didn't do it, why would they be so interested in not uncovering the truth about who killed their fellow officer? But I think we'll have to tease that for a part 2, because I do want you to make this point about why Mumia didn't have the best legal team he might have been able to have, at least initially.
Well, Todd said that he got some things from me, and yeah, I've maintained over the years and watching the legal teams come and go that if Mumia committed any crime, that crime was not being able to select good counsel. His initial counsel was a guy named Tony Jackson. And some of the leftists that initially gravitated around this case and helped publicize it, and to their credit, they conflated the problems with Tony's representation. Legally, that's called ineffective assistance of counsel. When you as a lawyer don't do all that you are supposed to do for your client. What they conflated that ineffective assistance of counsel is, they said the dude was incompetent. No, he wasn't incompetent. He knew what he was doing, but he was in so far over his head. Mumia is on trial for first-degree murder, which carries a death sentence. And in Philadelphia at that time, they did not allow adequate defense for people charged with this maximum penalty. So here was one attorney against the whole district attorney's office and the whole police department. And when he asked for resources for a ballistics expert, when he asked for resources for this and that, they said, okay, well, here's $100. Here's $100. $100? Really? When he finally got the witness list of all of the people that were interviewed by the police, Tony Jackson got that in discovery. The police had left a name, but they crossed out phone numbers and addresses. So the money that he had for a private attorney was, not a private attorney, but a private detective, that money was spent up with the detective trying to reconstruct the list, trying to put phone numbers and addresses to the people. Tony Jackson goes in, and why was Tony Jackson selected? Well, he was initially selected to handle a police brutality complaint that Mumia had filed. He filed a police brutality complaint based on being beaten up by police at the scene and beaten up by police in the hospital. They were kicking him, stomping him, just wearing him out. And that's what Tony Jackson did. And then there was a petition made for Tony Jackson to represent Mumia. Now, all right, so, truth be told, some of us said that Mumia needs a good legal defense team. He's on trial for his life. So we found one of the best young Black attorneys, a guy who was sharp as a scaffold. And he was one of Tony Jackson's boys. So it's not like we're saying Tony Jackson is a bad guy, because at that point, Tony Jackson was just handling the police brutality complaint. We take this information to Mumia, and he says, I don't want it. Huh? John Africa's going to defend me. Really? You're on trial for your life, and you want John Africa to defend you? You got that. So Tony Jackson starts getting into the case. Now understand, Tony Jackson, in the month before Mumia's arrest, had just resigned from an entity called the Public Interest Law Center of Philadelphia. And Tony Jackson was in charge of their police brutality project. Thus, he's the right guy to get for a police brutality complaint. He was setting up his own office when he was assigned to represent Mumia in the murder trial. He didn't have a secretary. He had a desk and an empty file cabinet. And now he has a murder case. When you're doing a murder case, you can't do much of anything else. So he couldn't do wills, real estate, burglaries, that sort of thing to bring in some money. So he's going broke trying to represent Abu Jamal. The courts are jerking him at every turn. And Mumia saying, well, you should be doing this for me. You should be doing that for me. And he should, but the courts were blocking him. So him and Mumia get into a tiff. Tony Jackson goes to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and says, me and my client can't get along. Could you take me off the case? And they said, hell no, you ain't, you can't go. And if you get off the case, we're taking your law license. So now he's stuck. And then Mumia says, I'm going to represent myself. So all of the discovery information and everything now goes to the prison. Tony Jackson's out of it. They said, you'll be backup attorney. Mumia starts representing himself during the first phases of the trial. He's doing well. The news accounts of it says that he was very businesslike and very, persistent and quiet. He's not upsetting the jury. And then one day the prosecutor comes in and says, Your Honor, I've gotten some word from, I don't know who, but I've gotten some word that the defendant is scaring potential jurors. Could you take him off the case? We know he's representing himself, but he doesn't know what he's doing. So just take away his right to self-defense.
And was the method of this terror explained? In other words, was it explained what Mumia was doing that was so scary?
Yeah, he's a black guy with dreadlocks on trial for murder. And the white people were afraid, according to the prosecutor. Now, they didn't do any voir dire, said, is this Negro scaring you? Yes, well, then go. Yes, no. They didn't do none of that. It was a naked misrepresentation. The judge bought it. And let's understand, this is the same judge who, before the formal start of the trial, is sitting in a back room of the court, and he's overheard saying that he's going to help the prosecutors fry the nigger. I'm going to help the prosecutors fry the nigger. So that's when right. Abu Jamal's right to self-defense, he was helping him fry the nigger. So the trial just devolved into that. Tony was put on the case at the last minute. He has no preparation, and then the trial goes on. Now, under trial procedure, after you're convicted of murder in a first-degree murder trial, you go into a separate phase called the death penalty phase, and you argue for life imprisonment versus death. Now, during that phase, you usually put on character witnesses. Tony Jackson didn't put on any character witnesses. Show you the bias in the courts against Abu Jamal. In a time period like 10 or 12 years after this happened to Abu Jamal, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court granted new trials to 87 defendants because their attorney did not put on any mitigating evidence during the death penalty phase. When it came to Abu Jamal, they said, well, Abu Jamal was in charge of his own case, so because he didn't put on witnesses, it's not his attorney's fault. Really? So, I mean, this shows you like the multi-layers of bias in the judiciary against this case. Tony Jackson is off the case. Abu Jamal eventually gets essentially like a dream team that was headed by Leonard Weinglass. They were the ones that handled the 1995 appeal.
And we also have a question here while you're at it, going through the timeline about the 2001 affidavit. Do either of you have something you could say about that?
I want to say something about it, and I'm not going to write like Lynn. I'm going to be a biographer. It's something I grapple with because.
Well, tell us what it was first.
Lynn, is it too harsh to say Mumia lied in the affidavit? Like, is that too harsh? I mean, the gun that he had in his hand for the entire time of his arrest, conviction, appeals disappears in that affidavit. Mm-hmm. He tells a story because the radical wing of the Weinglass lawyers say, look, we have this evidence of somebody who claimed that he shot the officer, and Weinglass and everybody's not using it, and you've been in jail for all this long time, and it's time for you to use it. So, Marlene Kamish and Elliot Grossman influenced Mumia to do this affidavit in which he tells a version of his story in which he's trying to get out. But I mean, that gun is not in the story. And with the, and because his brother also does the affidavit, the brother who was part of the confrontation with the officer who had never given his story, right? And the anti-Mumia people always talk about he never gave his story. Billy, he never showed up. Well, Billy gave an affidavit too. So this was in my view, and Lynn, correct me, this was a desperate effort for Mumia Abu-Jamal to get out of prison because it was 2001 and he was still in prison. So I want to know what your view of the affidavit is. It's something I grapple with as a biographer.
Yeah, the affidavit, let's just say, has some structural issues. Apparently, Mumia runs across the street, to go help his brother, and everything is just black. I just blacked out. I don't know what happened. Next thing I know, I wake up and the police are pummeling me. I think they're.
He had no gun in his hand, and because doesn't Billy say Mumia didn't have a gun, right?
Yeah, I mean this. Let's just there's some real issues with that.
There's some real issues.
And in all fairness to all sides, even some of the sides that don't deserve any fairness, affidavit that Mumia and his brother put together was not an adequate representation of what happened. However, that doesn't mean that what happened the way the prosecution said it happened.
Right, absolutely. Absolutely.
The prosecution's case just defies logic. But as we see in this whole Trump phenomenon, we have almost 300,000 people dead, and we got millions of Americans saying there's no coronavirus. We have a landslide election against Trump, and he's saying that he won. And this is the same Trump too, who said that his inauguration was the largest crowd ever. All of us were at the Million Man March, and it was 1 million times plus larger than Trump's inauguration. Ditto for the first and very bitterly cold inauguration.
Yeah, and I would also have to add, we also have a lot of people believing that Biden and Harris are going to be a radical departure from Trump, and I'm afraid that that's not going to be the case either. But I hear you in general. But listen, and I know and nobody agrees with me on that, so I don't want to, But listen. One of the reasons why I was happy to have us take this much time with, as Dr. Clark used to say, talking around the subject to talk about the subject, because it's not even fair for me to say it's a critique, because I think I understand what this documentary, 40 Years a Prisoner, is supposed to be doing. But one of the things, knowing a little bit about what you all have talked about, that was a little bit frustrating watching the documentary, is that I felt like if you're just tuning into this on HBO, or if you're just tuning into this because you saw something on social media, as much as one documentary could try to give some context, we heard almost nothing of we heard about the 78 shootout, but we heard, I don't think, anything of this 1981 killing of Faulkner and Mumia's involvement or alleged involvement. And then we didn't hear anything about the 85 bombing. Correct me if I'm wrong, which I thought, I just felt like if we're trying to understand the context of why this Move 9 and others are still locked up, I thought we should have heard at least something about that, and maybe even some of the other political prisoners, including Mumia, to put again in the context why a Move 9 is being locked up. It's not just an isolation of in a battle between the Move 9 or Move in Philadelphia. There's a broader context of Black liberation and political imprisonment and so on.
Right.
Lynn, what do you think about any of that?
You're right. There was a scant mention of 85. There was no mention of Mumia. But in fairness to what the filmmaker did and what he said he was trying to do was just provide that slice of a short period between, like I said, basically 76 to 79. It was really a story on two tracks. One, the story of Michael Africa Jr., who was born in a prison cell a week to 10 days after the August 8th shootout, and the valiant efforts that he went throughout his life to secure the freedom of his parents, who were two members of the Move 9, and then also their love story. I mean, they were, teenage lovers. They get into Move. Then they get incarcerated. They're separated for 40 years, and now they're back together, happy and all of that. There were so many aspects of even what was the focus of the documentary that weren't told. We hear a lot about the Move 9, and all of the Move 9 are out now. 2 of them died in prison, 7 of them are out, and Delbert passed earlier this year, although he was able to breathe free for a couple of months. Forgotten in all of this is that on August 8th, 1978, 12 people were arrested in that house. Todd, you ever hear about that? Just a rhetorical question.
No, I didn't.
Yeah, there were 12 people arrested in that house. There were the 9, and then there was another MOVE member, Consuela Africa, who's shown in the documentary. There was Davita Johnson, who was shown in the documentary. And then there was another woman whose last name escapes me now, but her first name was Sandra, and she was the wife or the partner of one of the Move 9 men. Now, it's curious what happened to these people. Now, let's understand the testimony from that 78 shootout was only the 5 men had guns, and that the women were only in the basement huddled holding children. They were all charged with murder and riot and just being, radical Negroes. I mean, I'm just being facetious here and I shouldn't, but, they had a whole litany of charges. Within 10 days, all of the charges were dropped against Davita because she didn't do anything. She was just in the basement, just got in the wrong place at the wrong time. Consuela was put on trial, but unlike the other 9, she was represented by an attorney. And in that trial, a jury acquitted her of all of the murder charges from August 8, 78. She was convicted of riot for an incident that happened on May 20th, 1977. And then the other woman was also put on trial, and she had the same level of culpability or lack thereof of the 4 women who ultimately were convicted and sentenced to 40 years. She was acquitted by a jury. So by all legal right, those 4 MOVE women should never have been sentenced to those onerous terms that they were, because their level of involvement or lack thereof was the same as the one woman whose charges were dropped and the 2 other women who were acquitted because they had some representation.
In fact, Lynn, I made a note for this because I believe it's the judge who says in the documentary something to the effect that he says, at their word, I took them that they were operating as a family and therefore should be punished as a family. But when it came to, and this point is made in the documentary, releasing them, they weren't taken or judged as a family. And to your point here, I don't even remember hearing about, I don't think I've ever heard about these 3, at least not at this level of detail. Again, they weren't charged and locked up as part of a family. So it was, again, another convenient use of the unity of the Africa family.
Well, professors, I'll use one of them highfalutin academic words. What the judge said was sophistry. Sounds good, but it was BS.
Yeah.
Let me also get a professorial a phrase taken from a TV show where it said, "Don't do the crime. Don't do the crime if you can't do the time." In courts, you're supposed to be sentenced based on your culpability, and as we've seen historically, with political prisoners ad nauseum, they take conspiracy and they just make it elastic to fit anything. So that's what was underlying Judge, was it Malmud? Yeah, Malmud. He didn't like them. They came in. Yeah, they came in as a family. But in terms of who did what, which was never conclusively proven, and the reality is that based on physical evidence and evidence that has been suppressed, Ramp was shot by friendly fire. There was no way, absolutely no way, for the MOVE men who denied that they were shooting, but if in fact they were shooting, where they were shooting from, below grade level, they're in the basement, the bullets are going out this way. how would a bullet hit ramp and go down this way if it's coming out of the basement, unless it's one of these magic bullets again? It comes out, it changes direction in the air, it hovers around like a drone that they didn't have in 1978, and then it hits ramp. It makes no sense. In fact, I just talked to a private investigator today who's done some work on the MOVE case, and he was a former highly decorated SWAT officer in the Philadelphia Police Department. And so I asked him, I said, let's play this devil advocate business. Is it possible for the caliber of gun that MOVE had in that basement for that bullet not to have shattered or degraded coming out of that house and hitting the wall before it hit ramp? He said it was impossible for a shot to have come from that basement and to have killed that officer. And in 1978, the police allowed 5 journalists to go down on the line with them. And I drew one of the short straws. So I was down there. So I saw this. The first shot came from an apartment building behind me. Everybody turns around and then they turn back, and then, all stuff just went crazy. There was a burst of gunfire. Then there was a lull, some tear gas shot in there, some smoke bombs. This is after they were pumping water in there. Then there was another exchange of gunfire. And what finally drove MOVE out of that basement was water. Fortunately, around the corner from where I was standing, because I was right across from the MOVE house, directly across from it. And, only by the grace of God that, I didn't get my brains blown out. But when I finally realized that it was shooting, you get that little delay. Oh, this is crazy. There's gunshots. Oh, get your butt out of the way. I ran around the corner and hid behind a fire department water cannon. They had this big truck that had a water cannon on it that was used for high-rise fires, and they pumped over 200,000 gallons of water into that basement. So this is, when I was telling this to the private detective today, he said, "How do you know they had 200,000 gallons of water?" I said, "Because I asked the dude who was running it how much water it pumps per minute, and I added up the time that he was pumping it. That's how I get that figure of over 200,000 gallons. Actually, I've come to the figure it was 250,000 gallons. And MOVE people, when they've come out of jail after 40 years and they start telling you what actually happened in that basement, they said that the water was up to their noses. And that's when they started coming out. And then, the media coverage was that they're putting their children out first. They're using the children as shields. No, they're trying to make sure that the kids are safe before they climb out. And of course, as you saw in the movie, Jared, that in the documentary, they said that Delbert came out and he was helped out of the basement by police officers. And then they thought that he had a gun. And he comes out like this. He only has on a pair of jeans. He don't have nothing on up here. So I guess it's like the George Jackson thing. George Jackson hid a 9mm pistol in his hair, allegedly. So, these lies that have historically been laid on Black people, and particularly Black radicals, we see it writ large in MOVE, not only in 78, but also in 85.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was first of all, so I said what I said about the documentary, but not at all meaning to take away from the very powerful story that is told. It was incredibly moving. Mm-hmm. It was great to see some of the detail of how MOVE lived. You do get a little bit of that, how they lived, and what their philosophy and worldview was, or is rather. Mm-hmm. And you get to see what I also liked about it. It kind of almost reminded me of that police documentary I always recommend. Do
Not Resist.
Do Not Resist. Thank you. Because there's almost a cinema verite element to this documentary where they just let you hear from the police and the prosecutors in their own. And and they're just sitting there, just very happy to be saying, look, man, yeah, I would do it all again. I would beat Delbert like that again if I had the chance. I have no qualms about this. These people are savages. That word was used. Yeah. And then one thing, I definitely take the second, say whatever you want to say, but then but they also show the extent to which they try to play the Black community back and forth off of MOVE, trying to get Black people to say they're a problem and then deny Black people in the community who are trying to say they're not the problem that you want to paint them out to be from being accessed, having access to media. Go ahead.
The media was horrific back then. You know, I worked in the newsroom at the time, and when the name MOVE was mentioned, then somebody would yell "Bowel Movement." I mean, this kind of attitude that was in newsrooms all across the city at that time. One of the many things that gets missed in this is that police brutality in Philadelphia at that time was not exclusive to MOVE. Most dramatic, arguably, but it wasn't. In the 3 weeks before then, police had shot and killed people. There was one guy named Winston X. Hood, a member of the Nation of Islam. Him and his partner were doing some vending in front of a bar in North Philly. There was some ruckus. They calmed the ruckus, but they had on their NOI, their Fruit of Islam uniforms. The cops rolled up and immediately thought that they were the ones that were doing something and start beating them. After they beat Winston Hood and his partner, Thomas Noblin, a police officer, and during this beating, some kicking of Winston Hood was done by a police woman. Now, police women at the time had a lawsuit against the Philadelphia Police Department for gender discrimination. And she's in there, just being as brutal as her boys in blue. But
it could all be happening. She could be suffering the gendered abuse and among her white colleagues in the workforce is still...
I'm sure there's a term psychologically for that.
Golly.
Cognitive dissonance, whatever you want to call it. But anyway, I'm saying is that, they beat Winston Hood to a pulp. They got his hands cuffed behind his back. A police officer rolls up, jumps out of his police car, runs up to Winston Hood, puts his gun in Winston Hood's stomach and shoots him, murders him right on the street. So the next day, there's a press conference, and being young and dumb, I said, "Well, wait a minute, excuse me. The man's hands were cuffed behind his back. Were they cuffed behind his back before he was shot or after he was shot?" "Well, it was after he was shot." I said, "Well, that's not what the eyewitnesses said. But tell me this: if in fact he has a gaping wound in his stomach, why did you exacerbate that wound by sticking his hands and cuffing him behind his back?" "Well, I guess I got out of there without getting whooped by the cops, But I mean, this is the kind of lies that were going on. And in that particular, there was an instance where the police invaded a high school graduation party in Germantown that was being held in the backyard of a minister. And they beat up kids. I think when Nelson Artist was shot and killed. Guy who was driving a cab, he took the wrong cab out. He didn't steal a cab. It was just, get that cab over there. Well, they wanted him to take, cab 101. He took 102. They reported 102 stolen, and the police shot and killed him. So there was all of this police brutality going on, and things would move or festering, and then they just erupted on August 8th, 1978. Originally because MOVE didn't get out of the house, but to show you the levels of corruption and skullduggery by the police department. In the documentary, you see a judge, Alfred DeBona, who was a civil judge, but he was a Rizzo crony. And so he took charge of all of the criminal aspects of the MOVE case. And in the days before they did the raid on August 8th, 1978, they said that, MOVE has to be out of that house. They went all over the city and arrested everybody that had anything to do with MOVE and charged them with being in violation of the agreement. And the agreement was you had to be out of the house. Well, if you arrest them in the Northeast and you arrest them in Germantown, they're out of the house. Why are you arresting them? They being the cops, even went to Richmond, Virginia. Okay? Richmond, Virginia is below Delaware. It's below Maryland. It's below DC, and it's halfway down into Virginia. So clearly those people were out of the house. And when they hauled them into court, they said, you're in violation of the agreement. If you renounce your membership in MOVE, you can go home. If you don't, you're going to jail. Tell me how that's not fundamentally wrong, but that's what they did. And so there's so many things wrong there. And this is the system that's supposed to be making things right and or ultimately making sure that justice is served. But as we all know, justice don't mean just us. And particularly at that point, it didn't mean just them move people.
Can I suggest that when we do part 2, because it sounds like we're going to have to do part 2.
It sounds like it.
maybe we need to do part 2 on Mumia's trial, because, you know, Lynn and I are probably two of the few people in the Mumia movement who's actually read the trial transcripts.
All 14,000 pages.
So listen, well, immediately when we wrap up immediately tonight, I will email the both of you and try to set up that part 2. And I'm not playing immediately, but I do want to. There's one question I have for you, Lynn, before we wrap up tonight, and then I do want to go through and get a couple of questions from the chat that I think you can, at least both of you can quickly address before you get out of here. And my simple question to you, Lynn, is what I always want to ask people when I get a chance to talk to them after they've been in one of these documentaries is there anything about your interview and or its presentation that was unsatisfactory, or is there anything, you know, is there any, I'll just leave it at that.
Well, the short answer is no. You know, I've been interviewed for just about every documentary or movie that's been made. So, you know, I talked to them for an hour and a half, and then it ended up in the documentary, you know, less than 30 seconds. I get that. I mean, that's the way those things are structured. And, you know, like Cecil Moore used to say, the civil rights activist who, you know, we talked about with the NAACP, he said, you know, just spell my name right. I know you're going to get everything else wrong, but spell my name right. So they didn't show me picking my nose or stumbling over words. So I'm happy.
Fair enough. Todd, very quickly, did you interview Mumia for your biography?
I did not. I asked him to have an interview way back in like 2000, and he sent me a very polite handwritten letter saying that he declined to be interviewed and congratulated me on getting my PhD from the University of Maryland. Like, he showed his encyclopedic knowledge in terms of, like, he knew who I was. I'm probably going to reprint that letter, because when I asked him, I said, you know, the response you give me, I'm going to use as an official response, right? I've not asked him again. And I don't know, in terms of what I'm doing, whether I'm going to ask him again, because I think I have some very critical questions to ask that he may not want to deal with. And I definitely understand that. The man is sick. The state has tried to kill him about 7 times, right? He may not want to be bothered with a little guy, you know, being a biographer, right? So I respect that. Let's see. As Frank Matthews says, Dr. Todd, the Mumia Murder Incorporated is fired.
Yeah, because you recommended that the last time you were,
Oh my gosh. I mean, I cannot wait for this 3rd volume, because as I said before to you, Jared, if Mumia had just done these 3 volumes of works, he'd be a legend, right? The fact that he's done all this other work, including, as I like to point out, establishing the scholarship of jailhouse lawyering, right? He did a book where he interviewed people. Now he's in prison. He's interviewing people by mail about jailhouse lawyering, establishing an entire academic discipline. The man is an extraordinary world historic figure, and I treat him very seriously and very critically, because I think he deserves that kind of scrutiny. Because as I've explained, up until maybe about 10 years ago, and Linn Washington can confirm this, Mumia wrote everything that he wrote using either a pencil stub or a pen cartilage, including his master's thesis, which he had to do twice. This is the level of harassment that he has gotten in these 40 years. So the fact that he has done this amazing work is an extraordinary thing. And by the way, I just want to point out, Linn Washington says, you know, I'm just some guy. Yeah, he's just some guy with a Yale law degree. Okay?
Yeah, I was waiting. I left this comment up there because I am familiar with this article, and we didn't even get to all of that too. But yeah, just some guy with a
just some guy,
a Yale law degree. Yeah.
Well, let me be clear. I respect lawyers. I have a degree from the Yale Law School.
Yes.
I don't have a law degree. Although I know a little bit of law, but as lawyers say, I know enough about law to get me into trouble, but not to get me out of trouble.
Okay, fair enough.
All right, I'm gonna let that go. I mean,
yeah, me too. I'm
gonna let Yale law degree speak for itself, right?
But again, as we wrap up, and both of us having praised Lynn for more than his work, but his character and his commitment, I think all of that is what is even more remarkable than all the degrees and awards. So Lynn Washington Jr., Dr. Stephen Burrows, I want to thank you both very much for taking this time tonight to wrap with us a little bit. And as I said, as soon as I click in broadcast, I'm going to be typing up an email about when you all are free for part 2, because there's so much more to talk about related to Mumia, and I'd love to have a discussion with you all about the transcript, which you apparently are a select few to have actually read. So
we've got to separate fact from fiction, because when you get so militant in your trial, Move tells you to calm down. That's saying something, right?
Yeah.
And there was a point where it happened, where Move literally told Mumia, be quiet.
Lynn, do you have a quick second to say something about this, as maybe even a teaser? Because we got to get to Good, who's going to have to get dealt with a lot when we talk next time.
Well, Wilson Good, oh God. That might be part 2 or part 3.
That's what I'm saying.
What happened in 1985 changed Mr. Good. He left office, and usually mayors, when they leave office, they go to some big law firm, but he wasn't a lawyer. He went and became a minister. And then he became, at some point, the head of an agency that works to unite families of persons who are incarcerated. So they put children together with their incarcerated parents. He was given the bag of doo-doo. Let me be clear, right? This wasn't his problem. And there are still people today who are upset with Move that they besmirched the legacy of Philadelphia's first Black mayor. Wilson Good was elected the first Black mayor of Philadelphia 301 years after the founding of the city. So you can tell how racist it is. I mean, Frederick Douglass was railing on racism in Philadelphia from the 1850s down to the 1870s. Wilson Good admitted that he made a mistake. One of the first mistakes that he made as mayor was appointing Greg Sambor as the police commissioner. And that's the guy that carried out the bombing. But during that 1985 incident, the thing that will forever be problematic for me with Mayor Good is that after the morning shootout, when the Philadelphia Police Department fired 10,000 rounds of bullets into the Move house, as well as set off 2 high potency explosive charges that literally blew the whole front of the house off, there was an effort to try to negotiate a settlement. And the people who were trying to do that was a guy named Jerry Africa, who was the right-hand man of John Africa. And then there was a West Philadelphia civil rights activist, Randolph Means, I think his last name was. And then the other person who was involved in this was a guy named Robert Williams. Robert Williams had just retired or resigned from being a judge. And at that point, he was the Democratic Party's official candidate for district attorney in Philadelphia. And I followed them as they went from house to house to house, trying to get somebody to let them use the phone. Let's understand, this is 85. This is before cell phones. This is even before the first cell phones that were as big as walkie-talkies that the cops use. Right. A woman finally let them in the house. They were on the phone for over a half an hour trying to get Wilson Good, even to the point of calling the Chief Justice of Pennsylvania Supreme Court, asking him if he could get in touch with Wilson Good. The Chief Justice calls Wilson Good, and Wilson wouldn't get on the phone. And Wilson is sitting in his basement with his kitchen cabinet. The friends the people that he, were using as his advisors, he was literally like less than 3 miles away.
Because remember, this is the same police department that stripped the Black Panthers to their underwear.
Yeah.
And had them back up against the wall in their underwear. And what was it, like 30-degree temperature, something like that, Lynn?
Well, it was during the summertime, but they
summertime, right?
Yeah, but Rizzo says that their pants accidentally fell down. But let's understand, not only was it the Philadelphia Police Department that stripped the Panthers naked, it was the Philadelphia Police Department whose vicious brutality against Black people was cited repeatedly in the 1951 petition to the United Nations, charging the U.S. government with genocide against Black people. We charge genocide. So Philadelphia has an ugly history of police brutality. In fact, in the wake of the 1918 race riot in Philadelphia, and it wasn't a race riot, it was white people attacking Black people. They call it a race riot. A new organization was founded called the Colored Protective Association, because they said that the NAACP in the city and in the Urban League in the city weren't aggressive enough about brutality. We're talking about 1918, 1978, 1985. And what do we have a few weeks ago? They shot and killed a man who was having a mental health episode. And this just burns me up about the media and so much stuff. If you type in mental health directive, Philadelphia Police Department, you will find the police department's official protocol for dealing with mental health, people who are having mental health crises. None of that has ever come up with any of the reporting on the vicious murder of Mr. Wallace. And they delineate steps. They first say de-escalate. And if you don't de-escalate, then you use a baton or chemical substances, mace or something like that. And only when all of those things fail, you shoot somebody. The first thing them cops did was shooting, and they shot him. They didn't follow the protocol. And then we still have a police department that's now headed by a Black woman who is just dancing around this. And the use of batons, those punk cops did not use their baton on Mr. Wallace. But later that night, another group of cops, and you all saw it, they swarmed around the car of this woman, Rakia Young, broke out the windows of a car, pulled her out, beat her down to the ground, pulled her 16-year-old nephew out, beat him down to the ground, snatched her baby out of the back seat, and then the baby shows up on a video made by the National Police Union saying, but for cops having found this kid wandering around in the middle of the night barefoot, we're the ones that help Black people. Yeah,
and wasn't it pictured? Wasn't there a picture of a woman, a female cop holding the child, a white woman holding the baby? Right? Yeah.
Kidnapping. Let's look up the legal definition of kidnapping. That's what that was. So this is a police force that has a history of brutality. In fact, in 1998, Human Rights Watch did an examination of 14 police departments across the country, including San Francisco. Colin Kaepernick was right. Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia. And it said that Philadelphia has a notorious reputation for brutality. And this is the police department that allegedly went to serve warrants in 1985, May 13th, and also to effectuate an eviction in August 8th of 1978. They're murderers, absolute murderers.
We might even have to include in this part too, Mumia Abu-Jamal's FBI files, that we can talk about Mumia's documentation of this police brutality as a teenager, and how the FBI followed him around, literally followed him around since he was 14 years old. Listing as his occupation in the FBI files, high school student.
I think that's the exact same thing they did with Fred Hampton and as well. I think he was 14 when they started surveilling him too.
What's interesting though is that I gave this to Lynn because I had a copy of this. This has also been somehow scrubbed from the web. It's interesting how things appear on the web and then disappear from the web, and you never get them again.
That's why we need libraries.
Absolutely. Frank Rizzo has an FBI file.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
And Lynn can talk about that too as well. Frank Rizzo's FBI file.
All right. Well, oh, man. Okay. Well, listen, again, the email's coming immediately because we will have to set up part 2. Again, I want to thank Linn Washington very much, Dr. Todd Stephen Burrows. Please, everybody, like, share, retweet, and all that good stuff. And check imixwhatilike.org for upcoming discussions. In fact, tomorrow we might be talking to Dr. Johanna Fernandez. We might be talking to Adolph Reed about Black Lives Matter. I don't know for sure. We got a lot of stuff, and a lot of other things are already scheduled. So, and then part 2 of this is as soon as we can figure it out. So, thanks again to you both. I really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks to everybody for checking this out and for any support that you have shown. And we'll catch you in the whirlwind. And as Fred Hampton used to say to you, we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.